Welcome and welcome back to Cafe Oleh. My name is Jay. Here at Cafe Oleh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed, whether that's reading and paying your bills, going grocery shopping and reading nutritional labels, striking up a conversation, keeping up with the news, flirting, dating, job interviewing, complaining, all the everyday things you do in your native language, in your country of origin, but here in Israel in modern Hebrew. As always, we'd like to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover. You can always be in touch with us by um, email at hebrew@nbn.org.il. You can also see all of our previous lessons up on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com, type in Cafe Oleh. You will see the first entry should be a link to our playlist. There's over now, I think, 130 plus videos and 22,000 views. You are obviously welcome to look over all of our previous lessons, leave us a note there, follow us on YouTube. But also, especially if you have requests for topics, maybe we've covered it in the past, maybe we haven't done it in a while, maybe we left something out. Those lessons are there for you for free to use whenever you'd like. This class itself will go up in the next day or so. And as always, if you're joining us live on Zoom, you can write to us in the chat with any questions, comments, concerns, and topic requests you'd like us to cover. If you're joining us live on Zoom, also, we leave the chat for that, and we ask you to use the Q&A when it's there. Yeah, the Q&A is enabled for any questions pertaining to this specific class. Okay. With that, let's get started, and thank you all for your patience in getting me, letting me start a little late today. So as promised, this week we're going to do a little bit of grammar, but I'm going to make it as practical as possible. And what we're talking about today is, I'm going to actually, where is it? I'm going to illustrate it for you. So what we're doing today is describing something called the verbal noun. The fancy word for it in English grammar is the gerund, G-E-R-U-N-D. This is essentially the equivalent of the ing of verbs. Um, the falling of leaves. It's being autumn, so that makes sense, right? And I'm going to illustrate what it is and isn't, and then I'm going to show, more importantly for our class, why it's so important in the Hebrew language. In Hebrew, the Hebrew grammar, it's called Shem HaPe'ulah, literally the noun of action. And it's used quite frequently. And as grammatical as this might be and a little over the heads of some people, at the very least to show you how common it is, so that when you are learning Hebrew in a more formal setting, it comes up, you recognize it when you see it. And towards the end of the class, in addition to answering any questions that are posted in the Q&A, I'll tell you about both Wednesday's Cafe Oleh conversation class as well as next week's class. So with that, let me open that up just a second. And this week, as opposed to previous lessons and most lessons where we do a spreadsheet, this is more grammar than it is vocab, but you're going to see vocab along the way. So we're actually going to be employing one of my favorite tools. This sort of dates me here, is slideshow spreadsheets. Not spreadsheets, PowerPoint. Okay, so what are we talking about and what are we not talking about? First, before we can even get into the meat of our class, we have to talk about what we're not talking about. This here is a regular sentence in Hebrew, right? Simple sentence, hu kotev b'machberet. Okay, and this is illustrating what we're not talking about today. Hu kotev b'machberet is a very simple sentence. Now, the difference is that in English, as you see here, you have the Hebrew at the top, the transliteration in the middle, and then two different ways we can translate the same sentence from Hebrew to English. In Hebrew, hu kotev b'machberet can be translated into English as either, on the left-hand side, he writes in a notebook, or he is writing in a notebook. In English, we have two different tenses. One's called the simple present, and the other is the present progressive. If that's too scary for you, don't worry about it. The point, though, is in English, hu kotev b'machberet is the same thing as he writes in a book and he is writing in a book, in a notebook. Those are two different constructs, right? In English, there's a difference between he writes in a notebook, every day he writes in a notebook, or at this moment, he is writing in a notebook. Those are two different tenses, right? Hebrew, they're the exact same thing. Hu kotev b'machberet. Okay? That's what it is. Now, notice that our second version, he is writing in a notebook, is ing. And I put this here on purpose to say this is not what we're talking about today. He is writing in a notebook is one of two examples of how to translate the sentence, but that's not the ing of the verb we're talking about. Okay? And as I share here, and don't worry, you'll get these slides as well. You can see here I diagrammed this sentence, both in Hebrew and English. Hu, meaning he, is the subject, in Hebrew, noseh. The verb is kotev, poel. Milat yachas, the preposition is be. And machberet is an indirect object, a notebook. Okay? Very simple so far. This is a simple sentence, but in English, it has two different definitions. Let's get into what we're talking about tonight. הכתיבה במחברת מאתגרת במיוחד. Instantly, even if you don't know what this sentence means, you understand we're talking about a much more complex sentence. First off, there's more words, they're longer words. And even if you don't know what they mean, you can already sound, for those of you who even have a basic level of Hebrew, this is more than just hu kotev b'machberet. Hu kotev b'machberet, a simple sentence, subject, verb, object. He writes in a notebook, okay? A simple, easy sentence. This, however, is not. הכתיבה במחברת מאתגרת במיוחד. Okay. What does this translate to as you see here? Writing in a notebook is especially challenging. So first off, a bunch of flags should be going up for you. Number one, this is a much more complex sentence. Number two, it's giving more detail, but more importantly, number three, the focus is on the act of writing, not on the guy who's writing, not on the notebook necessarily, but on the act of writing. Okay, so we've shifted our attention from hu kotev b'machberet, he is writing in a notebook, or he writes in a notebook, where the subject is the guy writing in the notebook, to the writing itself. הכתיבה במחברת מאתגרת במיוחד. How do I know what the subject is? First off, in Hebrew, just like in many other languages, including Indo-European languages, we still do subject, verb, object. So the first word here is the subject, haktiva. And I know that also because me'atgeret. Me'atgeret is technically a participle, and I'll diagram the sentence in a second. The point though is me'atgeret is complementing, it's in the feminine because ktiva is feminine. This is all to say this is a much more complex sentence, right? Even if this is over your head, you know this is a more complex sentence. Why is this important? First off, many Hebrew sentences will come like this. But more importantly for those of you who are learning Hebrew, as all of us are in this class, this is the level of English many of you come with, or your other languages that you come with. And in pointing out the ing of Hebrew verbs is not only important to improve your Hebrew, it's also to know you can communicate the same level of sophistication that you do in English or whatever your native language is in Hebrew. This is a great example. Writing in a notebook is especially challenging. If you're learning Hebrew, you're probably feeling frustrated, right? No matter your age, when you come with a college degree, maybe a couple college degrees, maybe some form of education, and you have to learn rudimentary sentences like hu kotev b'machberet. Obviously important because there are places where you're going to need to know how to say he writes in a notebook, or I write in a notebook, or I am currently writing in a notebook, or something of that kind. But let's say you want to put more into it, more detail, more explanation. That's where the ing will come in, because now the focus is not just on what we just talked about. There's more focus on the act of writing itself. Now, you could obviously combine all of this together. הוא כותב במחברת וזה קשה לו. He writes in a notebook and it's difficult for him. Okay. This sentence, though, is grammatically more sophisticated, just like I'm sure you want to be more sophisticated in your communication. That's a major point of today's class. Okay. So as you already see, writing in a notebook is especially challenging. We're not talking about him anymore. We're talking about the act of writing. That's what Shem HaPeula, that's what the verbal noun is, the act of doing something, writing. In this case, writing, right? The act of writing is ktiva. Ktiva is the verbal noun, what we're talking about. Okay? And see, much more complicated. We have many more grammatical terms for this sentence. That's the point here, right? We have the verbal noun, the preposition, indirect object, preposition. The point though is when you start recognizing and are able to use the verbal noun in everyday sentences, your communication goes, your articulation, your communication, the sophistication of your communication goes infinitely up. What we're going to do in the rest of this class is show you other examples of that, what it looks like, and how it manifests in everyday life. What we're going to do on Wednesday's class, and I'll remind you again at the top of the hour, is we're going to practice using these. I'm going to give you some sample sentences and questions to ask each other, and you're going to practice formulating sentences and replies using the verbal noun, because you're going to hear it and you're about to see a bunch of examples in everyday life. First, I'm going to give you the good news. The good news is this is going to be your guide in using verbal nouns. We've talked about this before. Those of you at a more advanced stage will know this, but we're going to review it again. Every word in the Hebrew language is comprised of two things: the root, the shoresh, and the form it takes, the form that creates the word. For nouns and adjectives, it's called the mishkal. For verbs, it's called the binyan. Okay. What you see here on the right-hand side, where it says Binyan in Hebrew, even if you can't read this, don't worry, I'm explaining all of it. What it says here on the right-hand side is Binyan. Binyan is simply the helper letters and vowels that we plug into a shoresh, a three-letter root, to create a verb. Okay. In modern Hebrew, there are 7 binyanim. What you see here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the 5 binyanim that create a verbal noun, the act of doing something, like we saw ktiva, for example. We're going to see a couple in a second. What you see here in the middle, it says here in Hebrew, shem peula, right? That's what we're talking about tonight, the verbal noun, the noun of action. The other way we can think of this is what we call the mishkal. If binyan is for verbs, mishkal is for noun and adjectives. In modern Hebrew, there's only 7 binyanim. Mishkalim, dozens and dozens and dozens. So much so that if you're a native Hebrew speaker and you're learning Hebrew as you have to as a required subject in high school, you don't even learn all of them. You maybe learn a handful of them because there's so many of them. And you recognize these. And we have a whole other class, by the way, another plug for YouTube, on Mishkalim. Just type in YouTube, Cafe Oleh Mishkal or Mishkalim on YouTube. You'll see a really fun class we did on this. Verbal nouns are exactly as the name says in English. It's the combination of a verb and a noun. We treat the word in Hebrew like a noun, but it's comprised of a verb and it's put into one of these formulations here. Okay, so what you see here on the right-hand side, binyan, we use the root pei ayin lamed to designate how we pronounce it and how we conjugate verbs, right? And what you see here is the past tense third person singular of each verb. If that's too complicated, just think he did something, okay? So the one form is pa'al, meaning that all the verbs that are in this category conjugate to rhyme like pa'al. The next one, pl, same thing. Hif'il, nif'al, hitpa'el. The verbal noun follows this form using the letters kuf, tet, lamed. Ktila, kitul or katala, haktala or hektel, hikaktlut, and hitkatlut. Let me make this clearer for you. Let's look at the verb, for example, lachash. Lachash means he whispered. Okay, lilchosh is to whisper. Ulachash, We know we pronounce it lachash because it's in binyan pa'al. Look at this from side to side now, right? If we're on our first line here, okay. Sorry, let me see if I can do that. No, I can't right now. Turn on the pen. Turn on the laser pointer, even better. Okay, we're right here. This is pa'al, binyan pa'al, named after how we conjugate the past tense, third person singular. He did something. Lachash, he whispered. Lachash pa'al. Pa'al lachash. Okay, they're pronounced exactly the same. They have the exact same vowel pattern with them. Okay, lachash, we're told because its shem peula is ktila, is lechisha, a whisper, or the act of whispering. To whisper, whispering would be the ing. How about the act of thinking? Okay, chashav means he thought. Chashiva, thought or thinking. Okay, that's how this works. The ing, literally the ing of verbs, whispering, thinking. PL is our next one, and it takes the form either kitul or katala. Ni'er is to shake something. He shook something. Ni'ur is to shake something up, the act of shaking. Or one that we know, probably you all know this word, right? How do you say you're welcome in Hebrew? Bivakasha. Where does that come from? Our verb here, bikesh. Bikesh, PL, bikesh means he requested, and its verbal noun is bakasha. Okay, bakasha is requesting or a request, the act of requesting something, asking for something. That's what we're talking about when we say verbal noun. Okay, this word up here, dugmaot, simply means examples. Our next one, hif'il. Hif'il takes the form either haktala or hektel. How do you say feeling in Hebrew? He felt something. Hu hilgish. Hif'il hilgish. Right? A feeling, the act of feeling something emotionally, halgasha. Okay? Hisbil. Hisbil is a great example of what we're going to talk about in a minute. Hisbil means he explained. Hesber is an explanation. We're going to come back to this one in a minute. Okay? Nif'al, same thing. Create other ones. Hitpa'el, same idea. This is when you are learning how to conjugate verbs, you're going to see this table. If you're not there yet, or this is a review for you, you know this comes along when you're learning past tense and future tense and command tense and all the other things that come with learning verbs in Hebrew. Why does it say at the top? It should, rather, if I move the menu, the most common verbal nouns. Because the good news is that the vast majority of verbal nouns, the INGs of Hebrew, will come in these conjugations, in these forms, right? Any verb that's in binyan pa'al will be ktila, lechisha, chashiva, ktiva, right? We just had this one right here. Where was it? Ktiva. Ktiva comes from lichtov. Lichtov is to write. Hu katav, he wrote. Aktiva, the act of writing. Okay. The good news is that the vast majority of verbal nouns will be like this. The bad news, there are many others that don't fall into this pattern. Why? The main reason is because in modern Hebrew, one of the standards of creating it is if there's a precedent in biblical Hebrew or Talmudic Hebrew that is widely known and popularly known, we stick to that. I'll give you a great example. This verb right here, and this very much has to do with current events, right? This verb right here. Hisbir is he explained. Lehasbir in modern Hebrew is to explain. So by this rule, why isn't it like hilgish, right? Hilgish is he felt, and it's halgasha. Why is hisbir not hasbara? Two reasons. One, because hesber as the meaning of explanation predates modern Hebrew. Right? It predates modern Hebrew. It had already been around as a word that was understood in Hebrew for centuries before. Hesber as an explanation. But number two, what is hasbara? Hasbara in modern Hebrew is not an explanation. Okay? It's not. It means a calculated effort to explain something for larger purposes. A simpler way to answer that is it's propaganda, right? Hasbara means propaganda. We won't necessarily call the means by which the state of Israel and other people use hasbara as propaganda because that doesn't sound good for us, but that's what it essentially is, right? It's literally explaining something as the word means according to this formula, but it means much more. And so in modern Hebrew, to say an explanation, the act of explaining something is hesber. Okay, so there's two different forms in this particular binyan, but it's also because one of them comes with more meaning. Okay, there are many more. I just want to focus on these because also, if this is very heady for you, and I understand if it will be, what the examples I'm about to show you will make it much clearer how to spot them and when they're used. Here's a great one. Literally taking pictures in the last few days, came across all sorts of verbal nouns everywhere. Okay. Number one, this is, as you might experience here in Tel Aviv or elsewhere in the country, this is a sanitation truck that's used to spray down the streets, right? And what does it say on the sign, the side of the truck? It uses a shem peula, a verbal noun. B'sherut Iriyat Tel Aviv Yafo Ezor Merkaz. Okay, that's the picture. If you see here on the right-hand side, I not only wrote out the sentence that's here, I highlighted where the verbal noun is in this sentence, the shem peula. I put at the top its infinite form, what form it takes in the to do something, and then I translated it. Okay, so very basic, not basic, more everyday examples of what we're talking about here when we say the verbal noun. Instead of saying, right, how could you otherwise use this verb? Because the verb is lisharet. Lisharet means to serve, and sherut, service, right? What could this this truck, excuse me, say instead? This truck serves the Tel Aviv municipality, right? That's not what it's saying. It's saying that this truck is b'sherut Iriyat Tel Aviv Yafo Ezor Merkaz, in the service of the Tel Aviv municipality, Tel Aviv Yafo municipality, central region. We get a lot of information when we use a verbal noun as the subject, right? It's implied that the truck is in the service of. We don't have to say that. We can save a lot of space here. And remember, Hebrew loves context. It loves shorter, more concise sentences. So that depends a lot more on context. This is a great example, right? B'sherut Iriyat Tel Aviv Yafo Ezor Merkaz. Obviously, we're talking about this truck. When this truck is going down the street and it's spraying the sidewalks on the street, we know that this line, that b'sherut, in the service of, is referring to what the truck is doing. The act of doing something, the verbal noun. Okay, a great example of this grammatical construct, literally in action. Let's look at another one. This one I also just took the other day. Another everyday example. If you are crossing one of the bridges from Ramat Gan into Tel Aviv, and you look quickly to your right, you will see one of many highway signs, like you'll see anywhere in the country, but this is specifically on the Ayalon Highway. And what does it say? If you can't read it, I wrote it right here. Hayetziot habaot, next exits, as it says in English. Guess what? The word yetzia, which we see on signage all throughout Israel, which simply means exit, is a verbal noun. Yetzia comes from the verb latzet and is the act of going out, the act of leaving, the act of exiting, an exit. Yetzia simply means an exit, but it is the verbal noun construct of latzet. Okay, so when we say hayetziot habaot, it's the places where you can fulfill the act of leaving, i.e., exiting in modern Hebrew or in modern technology, right? Latzet simply means to go out, to leave. But in this context, the act of leaving means to exit a highway. Okay, and so we call a yetzia is an exit off a highway. Let's look at another one. If you live in Tel Aviv or in any quickly growing place in country, you'll see one of these signs for sure, or some other sign related to real estate. This is one of many I came across just the other day. What does it say? have a lovely picture of a building. It has its quick shortcut number, and we have a whole class about calling numbers, but this is about verbal nouns. המכירה החלה. Okay, and here I have it written on the right-hand side, highlighted the verbal noun with the nikud, the vowels that go under it. המכירה החלה. The sale has begun. Sale literally in Hebrew means the act of selling. The act of selling has commenced, is what this sentence literally says. But in English, we would simply say the sale has begun. In Hebrew, hamechira, the act of selling, i.e., the apartments in this building, echela, has begun. This, as you see here, I'm not making this up, folks. I'm not inventing something for the sake of anything. I'm taking these literally from everyday life in Israel in Hebrew and pointing out how commonplace this construct is. Okay? Hamechira echela, coming from the verb limkol, which means to sell. Mechira, the act of selling, aka sale. Let's look at a great example. 2 for the price of 1. You go into any bus or any train, but especially a bus or a rakevet kala, a light rail. We have a whole class on transportation before, and you need to pay. In Israel, thank God, now we have multiple ways of payment, not just with an old Rav-Kav, a physical card, but you can pay also with a yisumon. A yisumon is the Hebrew version of the word applicatia, application. What do you see here on both sides? On the right-hand side, you see the LED screen or LCD screen, however you call that, in most buses. And on the left-hand side, you see a placard that's also on most buses. And what does it say here in English? First off, what does it say in Hebrew? Letikuf beselulari. And it says here in English, which is why I didn't write out the whole thing in English, for cellular validation, right? Obviously, celulari is going to mean cellular in English, but tikuf, coming from the verb litakef, tikuf is the act of validating. Litakef is to validate something like a sticker or a ticket. In this case, the act of validating, i.e. in English, validation. This isn't a word that ends in ing in English, but it's the same meaning. The act of validating something is validation. Letikuf beselulari. Okay, and that's what it's pointing you to do. Hold up your phone, scan the QR code. You have validated your ride, right? Same thing over here on the big screen where it also asks you at the bottom, na lehaniach et hakartis, and if you don't know what that means, the little picture of the hand with either the Rav-Kav or a cell phone with a credit card should point out this is where you placed your card to pay for your ride. But it says here at the top, letikuf beyisumon, to validate, for validating beyisumon, an application. Right? The same idea, just as you see here, it's written over here and also has another QR code. Okay, tikuf. Again, folks, I'm not making this up. Literally taken on a bus, riding on the other day. 2 versions of the same verb in shem peula form, in the verbal form, the verbal noun pattern, tikuf, coming from the verb litakef. Okay. Finally, I think this is it. No, we have 2 more. Also on a bus. Tichat delet becherom. In English, it translates as emergency door release, right? You're on a bus, you look up, right next to the sign that says letikuf beselulari, for cellular validation, it says ptichat delet becherom. Guess what, folks? Pticha is a verbal noun. Pticha coming from the verb liftoach. Liftoach is to open. Pticha, opening, the act of opening a door. And in English, on the sign, the original sign, it translates as emergency door release, which is what this contraption is doing. But the literal translation, opening the door in an emergency, right? If I want to say opening the door in an emergency, this thing right here, ptichat delet becherom. Okay, that's what it's referring to, opening the door in an emergency, i.e. an emergency door release. Again, it didn't translate, it said, na liftoach delet becherom. Please open the door in an emergency using this dial. Many more words, and instead we have a directive that's understood not only because there's a handy diagram right there what to do, but it's understood this is what you do becherum, in an emergency. Okay, how to open the door. In Hebrew, it's much easier to say ptichat delet becherum instead of the literal translation from English, how to open a door in an emergency. Okay, one last example, and then I'm going to take your questions. This one I thought only had two. It actually has three verbal nouns in one ad. I was walking back at the street from somewhere and I saw this on a poster. I blanked out the two ads for pot on either on the top or the bottom. But this one has not one, but two, but three verbal nouns in one ad. So I'm going to read the whole ad and then we're going to go through it. קליניקה להשכרה באזור זה לפסיכולוגים ומטפלים. מחירי מבצע לרגל הפתיחה, החל מ-25 ש"ח לשעה, טלפון, קישור ישיר לוואטסאפ. Okay, it's got three. First one, להשכרה באזור זה. Again, once you recognize the forms, Hif'il in this case is להשכרה. Anyone who's ever looked for real estate in Israel knows this word. להשכרה means for rent. Okay, להשכיר means to rent out a property. Haskara is the act of renting. Okay, lehaskara for rent. Be'ezor ze, in this area. Lipsychologim umetaplim, for psychologists and practitioners. Meaning it's a, as it says here at the top, klinika. It's a clinical space. Mechirei mivtza, sale prices, discounted prices. Leregel, in advance of hapticha. Okay, hapticha, we just had that word, right? Ptichat delet becherum, opening the door in emergency. Leregel hapticha, in advance of opening up this new clinical space. Mechirei mivtza, there are discounted prices. And the discounted prices start from 25 shekel hour. And what does it say at the bottom? In the very small print that I'm now reading, I thought it said Tofes, it says WhatsApp. Kishur yashir. Kishur comes from the verb likasher at the top here. Likasher means to connect. Okay? Kishur is the act of connecting, aka connection. In modern Hebrew, 21st century Hebrew, kishur is a hyperlink. It's a URL. Okay? It's a website address. In this case, in the form of a QR code. But kishur is no less a verbal noun than pticha and haskara. One ad, three different verbal nouns. Again, showing you how commonplace verbal nouns are. All you have to do is look at these examples of the most common way they're conjugated and they're formulated, seeing them in everyday life, just like all of these, you'll recognize, first off, most important is to recognize them. What is this word I'm looking at? What does it mean in the context of what I'm reading? And then, which what we're going to do on Wednesday for those who join us, is how to actually practice using them. How do we formulate sentences and replies and create communication with each other using the verbal noun as the subject or the object of the sentence? Okay. I know this was a lot of grammar. I know that's difficult for people, which is why I want to be sure there were pictures from everyday life to make sure that number one, I'm not making this up again, but number two, how commonplace it is, right? From an ad on a random ad I saw walking up the street, to bus signatures, bus signage, to real estate, to highway signs, to municipal services. We use verbal nouns. Shemot peula is the plural all the time. Okay, I want to break here, answer some questions. Stop share. Okay, I see we have a bunch in the Q&A. Someone correcting my English. Yes, there should be bimiuchad. Thank you for pointing that out. We'll change that before we send it out. When would you say haktiva hi? Great question. If you wanted to emphasize, right, in our first sentence, let me show that again. right? If we go back, I already changed it because I see a number of people pointing that out. I love how detailed your eyes are in looking at these things. Okay. הכתיבה במחברת מאתגרת במיוחד. You will see sentences where this first part, right, the subject of the sentence is much more complex, and there's maybe some clauses attached and things like that, that they'll use the preposition he. Why will they do that? If it'll let me do that. To make sure we know what we're referring to and what we're modifying with מאתגרת במיוחד, right? מאתגרת במיוחד, especially challenging. But let's say this went on a whole rant. הכתיבה במחברת, writing in a notebook while in your spin class for the 10th time this week is especially challenging. If it had more dependent clauses going on at the same time, you would want to put in the he to make sure we're referring back to remind ourselves that we're referring back to this as the subject. So when we get to something like this, we understand what we're talking about. That's why you would use he. He is only used there as as a reminder of the subject, but it's unnecessary, right? This is completely understood. הכתיבה במחברת מאתגרת במיוחד. Okay. A lot of times non-native Hebrew speakers will put the he in there because Hebrew doesn't have the present tense form of the verb to be, right? There is no is in modern Hebrew. Instead, it's assumed here, or it's part of the verb that goes with it. Great question. Okay, let's see some more there. I thought that the Shem HaPe'ula is the Lamed verb. No. Shem HaPo'al is how we say the infinitive form in Hebrew. Shem HaPo'al is the Lamed before a verb. That means to something. Shem HaPo'al is the name, literally the noun or the name of the verb. This is the name of the action. Pe'ula is action. Is a verbal noun the same as a gerund in English? Yes, it is, as I explained earlier. I interchanged those two words. There is a slight difference in them, just as we saw tonight. In English, the difference is that one of them always ends in ing, the other one doesn't. It doesn't really matter. But verbal noun and gerund are for more or less the same exact thing. So the yud we expected in bakasha did not appear. Correct, right? Because, again, in PL, there's two different ways to create a verbal noun, right? There's two different ways, either hitul or katala, ni'ur lena'er, or bikesh bakasha. Bakasha is no less valid a form than the other one, right? You may know the word dibul. Dibul is a conversation, right? The act of ledaber, to speak. Ledaber, to speak. Dibul, conversation, speaking. But in this case, bikesh becomes bakasha. Are all gerunds feminine in both form and gender? Great question. No, they're not. And let's look again at this slide I just showed. You slideshow. Okay. In all of these forms that we're looking at, remember I said before that there are other forms of the verbal noun, but these are the most common ones. Of all of these, there's one that's masculine, kitul, right? Ni'ur, dibur, sipur, anyone, limud, any of them that are of kitul in PL is masculine. Otherwise, everything else here is feminine. Simple reason, they end in hey. When a word ends in hey, almost always it means that it's feminine. So lechisha, chashiva, bakasha, hargasha, hikalelut, hitalmud, because it ends in the ut, hitragshut, hitkarvut, all of these are feminine. The only two, actually there's two here that aren't, excuse me, it's not just one. Ni'ul is masculine and hesber is masculine. So hektel and kitul are masculine. Everything else is feminine, simply telling by the end. When a word ends in a, hey, or ut, chances are they're feminine. Great question. Let's look at some more questions. Why hechela na hitchila when the verb is latchil? It's because your presumption is incorrect. There are two verbs in Hebrew that mean to commence or to start doing something. One of them, as you rightly pointed out, is lehatchil. The verb in our signage, right? If it'll let me open it up. The verb in our signage here is not lehatchil. Just because it means in English begun, it is not the same verb. The verb lehachel also means to commence or to start something, typically anew. This is not lehatchil, this is lehachel is the original verb. But way to try to get me, but you missed, but you're absolutely right. Both of them mean begun. This is, however, a different verb altogether. Okay, let's look at some more questions. Thanking someone for staying in touch. Toda ala hitkashrut. That's a very polite, formal way to say it. It's a great way to say it. Toda ala hitkashrut. Or simply in Hebrew, you would also say toda shehitkasharta. Thanks for calling me. But toda ala hitkashrut, thanks for being in touch. Great way to pronounce it. It seems the position of the year could be very helpful, and surprisingly in Hebrew, it dropped out of position 3 and PL position 2. What is the Ivrit for verbal noun? Let me show it to you again. Shem ha'peula, but let me show you spelled out. You have it here in your handy presentation that you'll see in a minute. It's this word right here, Shem ha'peula. Shem ha'peula, verbal noun. That's how you say it in Hebrew. Okay. Let's look at some more questions. And we have remaining. Can you go over the last sentence in the last ad in for the rental, please? Totally lost. Yes, I will in just a second. What do I mean by sanitizing the streets? In Israel, we sanitize the streets. There's literally a truck that goes along and sprays water and maybe a combination with some cleaning fluid and sprays the streets. Okay. Hitpalel verbs, are they reflexive in meaning? Hitkalvut closest. Hitpael are either reflexive or reciprocal. It's the equivalent in English of to get or to become something. Okay. Do verbal nouns have separate forms for male, female, and plural? No, they are pluralized, right? Ktiva is the act of writing. Tivot could be the acts of writing if you had multiple things going on at the same time. Or for example, hesberim, right? Hesberim, explanations would be the way you would translate that. Are there any rules to help you ID a word as a verbal noun? First off, it'll make sense. Once you are more familiar with how verbs conjugate, it will make a lot more sense if this verb conjugates like I'm taught in past, present, or future, or it looks different. If it looks different, it's probably a verbal noun. I'm going to send with you, in addition to this spreadsheet, I'm going to send with you an exercise I found online for native Hebrew speakers of turning verbs into verbal nouns. So you practice conjugating, okay? It's you'll see the pattern repeats itself over and over again. And I'll even write out the instructions in English for you because it's a really good exercise. Okay, number one. Can I go over the last sentence and the last head for the thing? Absolutely. Let me do that, and then we will break for today. Okay, so it'll let me do this. Okay, what is the sign for? In big letters at the top, it says klinika, clinic. Lehaskara be'ezor ze, for rent in this area. You can use the right-hand side, the bigger text. For rent in this area, a clinic. לפסיכולוגים ומטפלים, for psychologists and therapists. מחירי מבצע, discounted prices, the prices of a sale, a discounted sale, לרגל הפתיחה, in advance of opening this clinical space. החל starting from 25 shekel לשעה, 25 shekels an hour for rent, the phone number, and then it says under it, קישור ישיר לוואטסאפ, a direct link. Okay, that's another way we translate the word kishul in everyday language, but it means direct connection, direct connecting. We're doing the ing here to WhatsApp and scan the QR code. Okay, so it's advertising a space for clinicians, practitioners, therapists to use in the area for rent in advance of opening the space, a discounted price of 25 shekel an hour. Okay, again, I know this was heady. I know this was a lot of grammar, which is why I wanted to show those pictures to show you how often it shows up, as well as that conjugation box of how those verbs normally come out. I'm going to send with you with this PowerPoint an additional exercise that you can do at home as homework. Homework's always important, where you're able to practice conjugating these verbs into the verbal noun and reverse. And on Wednesday's class, for those of you who join us for Cafe Oleh Conversations, you're going to be using these verbal nouns. I'm not necessarily going to make you conjugate them on the spot. I'm probably going to give you more of them than you're going to have to conjugate on your own, and you're just going to have to use them in the context of everyday conversation. And you're going to see how commonplace they are in our everyday talk. Okay, with that, we are at the top of the hour, so we do have to go, unfortunately. So first off, toda rabah, thank you all for joining. Wednesday's conversation class, and we highly encourage all of you to join. There's space for everyone, especially if you've never come before. We're going to be practicing using verbal nouns in everyday communication. Next week's class is a big one, is one that we've done in the past and we will continue to do because it's so important, which is common mistakes Hebrew speakers make or Hebrew learners make and what to say instead. These are, some of them are funny, some of them are embarrassing, some of them are a little bit more R-rated than we perhaps want to intend to say. But these are very common mistakes that we make all the time when we're learning Hebrew. And instead, I'm going to give you what you should say instead. So it's a combination of both common things to point out that we do and also better ways to communicate in Hebrew than we're necessarily employing on a regular basis. With that, toda rabah, thank you all for joining. This class will be up on YouTube in the next day or two, along with the PowerPoint and the extra exercise I promised you. And until I see you Wednesday or next week, lehitrot. See you all very soon.